Hello to you all. I'm Stan Grant and we're coming to you live from Sydney tonight. Joining me on the panel in collaboration with Sydney's All About Women Festival, Refugee and Gender Policy Advisor Najeeba Wazefadost, Educator, businesswoman and pioneering feminist Wendy McCarthy, best-selling author and entrepreneur Lillian Mami Ahenkan. Also joining the panel, founder and editor of online magazine Quillette, Lehmann, and President of the National Farmers Federation, Fiona Simson, who also runs a family farm in her spare time in northern New South Wales. Good to have you all here in person, and terrific to have more of you in the room as well. Give yourselves a clap. This is the biggest crowd we've had in a long time because of COVID and all the lockdowns and all the disruptions. So it's fantastic to have you all in the room.
Thanks. I still come across people who believe that feminism is about disempowering men. My feminism is not about bringing men down, but about building women up. The misunderstanding about this encourages resentment and fear amongst some men. How can we make our brothers understand that feminism is not something to fear and in fact is not really about them at all?
Thanks for that, Bethany. Before I put it to the panel, you have 3 boys, I understand, as well. Is that right?
That's right.
In their teens?
14, 15 and 16.
So is this a conversation you have with them a lot about how they see themselves and their relationship to women and the world around them? How's that conversation go?
I've brought them up to lead by example, as a woman leading by example in their life. So I'm the main breadwinner, I always have been. I present a strong role model for them. And as far as I can see, they really see no difference in what men and women can achieve. It doesn't even come across as something that even may be an issue for them, which I'm not sure about other families, but I'm really pleased about that in my family, in that there's lots of strong women in my family and they just expect that as something normal in life. Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll go back to you on that, Claire. Just a response to that idea, as Bethany put it, that...
I'd like to too.
Yeah, no, Wendy, we will most definitely come to you on that. But the idea of disempowering men while women are empowered, what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's important to frame the conversation around a positive-sum game. So just because women are winning doesn't mean that men can't win as well. And I think too often we can get trapped in this framework, this narrative, which is zero-sum. Because men are winning, because men are in these powerful positions, therefore women aren't in those positions. We can actually create, we can step back and choose to see the world as an abundant world where we all have opportunities and we can all create value and we can all win. And I think just framing it in those positive terms goes a long way.
Wendy?
I think 50-50 is a concept. And you have it out there. If you look at the normal curve, it comes up like that. There's a time when you're on one side because you're doing one thing in a relationship or a family or in your job, and then the other person fills in. But the idea of equality is, in a sense, do no harm. So the negative outcomes are not the outcomes that any feminist would wish for. And I think that Ipsos has just done a poll, which I was reading about this morning. I mean, on the last thing I'd say in Australia, there's 27% of women in the cabinet. Well, that is not anywhere near a reasonable number. But the thing about the Ipsos poll was that, and it's a world poll, was done 3 days ago, 29% of people in the world who answered the poll thought masculinity was under threat. And we have to listen to that. 26% would, 1 in 3 thought that feminism could do more harm than good. And 15%, rape, violence, victim blame. And in Australia, 3 out of 10 don't believe that gender equality exists. They're They're wrong, but they're pretty. You know, they're the numbers.
Is this a poll, a general poll?
It was done as a worldwide poll,
right,
and
right.
For Ipsos, and Julia Gillard and someone else discussed it a couple of days ago, and it was put up online. And I just got it, and Virginia Housiker sent it to me, and I thought it was just remarkable, the variation in numbers, and you know, just the education, the attitudes to that, which is quite scary because, especially around violence and safety. You know, this little group I'm with says respect, safety, and equity. And that's a nice way to think about it too. If we get respect, it's respect that's missing in our public discourse that I find more threatening and ugly than anything else.
We'll go to our next question, which will pick up on that. But before I get to that, I wanted to come to you, Najeeba, because your dad's here tonight. He's come with you in the audience here, and you've spoken about this, about the role of your dad in your life, and culturally how these questions of men and the disempowerment of men or the empowerment of women play out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. Every time I start being in a forum where we talk about gender equality, you know, the gendered empowerment, the gendered approach, I tend to see that, at least for us, we are 4 decades behind from any of this conversation in my own community, in my own country, even those that have arrived on the shores of Australia. I mean, I have been quite lucky to have, you know, supportive men around me, especially my father, who's with me here. He's been so supportive in ensuring that I turn out to be an educated woman, a woman who can have her own voice and her own dream and visions. I think it goes back to what we were talking about, you know, the question is that why do we even have to have a language around who's the winner? You know, we need to be allies. We need to be supporters to this conversation. We cannot do it alone as women. We need men to be allies. And I think today, if I'm a bit successful in my journey of advocacy when it comes to gendered issues, to refugee issues, it's because I have had a strong father behind me, standing up to my community and say, this is what I actually support. This is actually why we came to Australia. And I think these are the kind of allies that we require in community and society. And we also need to acknowledge that men do come with a set of privileges. And most often we tend to forget that. They're actually born, you know, as a result of patriarchy. And that itself, you know, talks loud to the discrimination and racism and the indifferences that exist out there. But I think, again, for me, I've been quite successful to have that, you know, mentor, that support around me. And I think it makes a huge difference in any woman's life, especially in the young woman's life, who would be the future generation to this.
Stan, I was just going to say, I think it's about how you define feminism, isn't it?
Exactly.
If you look about winning and losing, then you're on your journey to nothing, really.
Exactly.
Whereas if you're thinking about winning and winning, if you're thinking about choice and empowerment, then it has to be, it's a cultural thing, and that culture has to be women and men. And I totally agree with Bethany. I've got, you know, a daughter, a daughter-in-law, a granddaughter. They're all growing up to be great, strong women. It's fantastic. But that's in no way, you know, disempowering the men. It's actually enabling everybody, I think, to have a better culture.
We'll take you to Lismore, and Naomi Worrell is standing by on Skype for us. Naomi, thank you for giving us your time as well. What's it like for you at the moment?
Well, it's been pretty intense. I live in North Lismore, and I was just one of thousands who was caught in our homes as the waters rose at just such an unbelievable and frightening speeds. And it's really hard to explain the scale of shock and grief and loss so many in my town are experiencing. You know, we have been running out of food and fuel, and people need shelter. And we'll be without essential services for the foreseeable future. And it's kind of just hard to see how Lismore comes out of this. It's been so huge. But the community has been phenomenal, you know, pulling together teams of volunteers and really achieving the impossible. But what's really been missing is, you know, what the government's doing, you know, with billions of taxpayers' dollars set aside for, you know, events such as this. Why has the government response been so inadequate? You know, if it's not for these kind of events that these funds were set up for, then how disastrous does it have to get?
Yeah, look, thanks for the question. We might come back to you as well and just get a bit more on what's happening on the ground, but I'll put that to our panel. Let's look at the numbers. Claire, I'll go to you on this. I mean, $480 million so far in disaster payments. We talked about 300. It's now over 400,000 people who've received this. There is money for mental health. There's $25 million for emergency relief for businesses. We know that money's being paid directly into people's pockets as well. You can certainly understand the frustration and the anger that it's not enough or it didn't come soon enough. Are there limits to what can be done? You know, we know the money has to come from somewhere. We've dealt with COVID, we've dealt with bushfires, there have been emergency payments for so many things. How do we get that balance right? Where do we go to? And understand this is money's going to increase as well, I'm sure, in the coming months.
Look, I don't think money is probably the issue here. The government has a lot of money. I think the issue is probably workforce. There's only so many people in the Australian Defence Force who can be deployed to any community at one time. They're already saying that they're quite stretched. They're not trained for disaster relief. Perhaps the federal government or state governments need to invest in a natural disaster workforce, whether they're voluntary or like firefighters, they're on, you know, they're put on holiday for half the year and the rest of the year when we have natural disasters, they go to work. I don't know, but I imagine it's the workforce that is the issue. And I mean, the federal bureaucracy that we have is quite slow. They don't run on social media time, but once they start a job, they're usually quite thorough. So I think the support will come through eventually.
But Wendy, you just said a plan. You've been involved in government. How do you plan for something, and how do you plan for something when we know that these things are often unexpected or so much worse than we could have anticipated?
The unexpected. That's the whole point of scenario planning. But you have a few scenarios that you work out and you think, if this happened, what would happen? What are the consequences? But the federal public service has pretty well been gutted. I mean, it's a great public service. It was one of the best ones in the world. And the market solutions don't work for everything. There needs to be a government solution, there needs to be a market solution. And it's still come back to the issue of care, but in terms of flood, there's a failure to recognise that climate change might just have a tiny little bit to do with this. And we haven't come at a peaceful spot in the centre about how we deal with climate change. We say that we don't want to give money away to people, and yet this is the biggest giving away money to people government in my lifetime.
Maybe if I add something to that as well, I think what we're also missing today is that Australia moves on a very ad hoc basis when it comes to response and planning. I mean, we tend to often to wait for the crisis to happen and then come with a planning action around it, and where it requires some sort of facilitation around preparedness of the community as well. Like, I mean, if you introduce something, you've got to make sure that the community is ready to accept and implement it at the local level. I mean, you're not going to be able to introduce this, responses and policies and programs and, millions of money without the community knowing how to use it or where to use it, So that requires, a sustainable intervention, a long-term intervention, and not only ad hoc and one-off. And we need, and more importantly, what we need to do is to deliver them at the right time, in a timely manner.
But the community needs to know where they can go to for help and things too.
And as you say, when you dial 000 and you don't get a response.
And so there is a local group I know in Lismore that's been looking at flood preparation and mitigation and what they can do in a physical sense. Is it about bearing in mind climate change, bearing in mind the swings we're going to have in climate, and they're absolutely, some of the people in Lismore and some of our affected communities, they've been in this situation over and over. Some of them have been in it 2 or 3 times in the last few years. And so if that's going to happen, how can we prepare better? How can we support communities that don't have big workforces, where there isn't the population, so that they can get support when it happens, and then that, again, we can then put money into that resilience and recovery stand that our question was about.
Yeah, Naomi's still standing by. If Naomi's still there, just before we let you go, Naomi, what do you do tomorrow? We sit here, we look at this and we think about the cleanup and what you've got, and you've got to wake up and face this tomorrow. What does tomorrow look like?
Today and the last 12 days, and however far into the future, it's just a lot of cleaning. But I do need to say, look, what the community did and the rescue operations, like right from the rescue operations, which were phenomenally huge and well organised, right to the ongoing, resilience of the kind of groups that we were just talking about. The community knows what to do. We're doing it. We just need You know, we don't have to
Just
pay
need support.
consultants for 3 years to come up with a plan. The community knows what they do. We just need those services funds on the ground.
Yeah.
Good on you, Naomi. All the best. You know, everyone here obviously is thinking about what you're going through, and all the best with it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
As a Ukrainian Australian, I've been really heartened to see the global support of Ukraine these past couple of weeks since Russia's invasion. But really, it's only been the EU who's taken concrete steps to address the refugee crisis. I've taken several calls from family and friends in Ukraine who have asked me how to seek safety in Australia. But knowing Australia's refugee policies and practices, I find myself warning them about the risks of potentially joining Australia's refugee queue. I'm wondering, is there an opportunity here to take this global solidarity, the current solidarity that we have with Ukraine, and use that to improve Australia's refugee policy and make it work better for everybody who needs it?
Flex?
I feel like Australia's in denial about their stance on refugees and asylum seekers, and I think that while it may feel like now's a great opportunity for it, I mean, it was a great opportunity years and years ago, and what happened then? I think that in times like this, we can apply pressure, but is it going to be just another PR angle? You know, another way for Australia to be like, we did the right thing at the right time, like you asked, right? And then forget everybody else who is currently impacted and will still not get the support that they need. I mean, people have said it time and time again. Australia's policy on refugees is barbaric. It's been said 1,000 times before. So I am really interested to see if something would happen. I remain hopeful, but I think that at times like this, we kind of need to. What is the appropriate way to say we need to let? When someone shows you who they are, you need to believe them. In this instance, I think Australia has shown us time and time again how they feel about people seeking asylum on our shores.
Najeeba, you've experienced this, and I'm sure that when you look at what's happening in Ukraine and you see experiences that you've been through, so what would you say? Tanya's talking about people she's in touch with who are looking to come to Australia. What would you say to them?
I mean, to be honest, first and more importantly, every time I look into the media and I see, you know, those horrifying, incidents of people wanting to escape, fleeing and escaping violence and horror, it really takes me back to my own time as a young girl back in Afghanistan and how difficult it was for me and my family to escape, that decades of war and injustice and inhumanity. And what a shame that today the history is repeating itself today, We're just talking about the Ukraine crisis, and exactly the same thing is happening in my own country, The gender segregation back in the 1990s is playing a huge role right now for a lot of women being imprisoned of their own gender, for a lot of women being actually having denied access to the most basic human rights. I mean, what I would actually say to all of this crisis, especially to the refugee issue, which has been a long outstanding issue in Australia and has been played out throughout the politics, especially when we are close to the election, it turns out to be something else. At least, in my case, I came to Australia by boat back in the year of 2000 because that was the only route available. And now if we compare this to the context of Ukraine, are we going to go and ask the refugees in Ukraine that you're not allowed to go by land, you have to get a plane to get out of Ukraine? I don't think that's what we expect from the world. We definitely, as a signatory to the UN Convention, Australia is a signatory to the UN Convention. It has its own obligation, it has its own responsibility, and they need to show their part. We need to welcome Ukrainian refugees into this land. Whether it is, again, the Ukrainian refugees or the Afghan refugees, we have a role to play, and we're obligated to provide protection to those that are in huge need right now. But unfortunately, that is not the case in Australia because we tend to play with our politics. Just with the crisis of Afghanistan, Scott Morrison announced 3,000 intake. Let's compare this with the other world. Canada introduced 40,000. That's a shame that as a big country like this, full and rich, we are only willing to provide protection to 3,000. And lastly, I think I want everyone in this room, because every time when I look at the Ukraine situation and also the Afghanistan situation, any other refugees in Bangladesh, in Thai Burma border, in any other context, I always ask myself, if we put the Ukrainian refugees in detention center today, how would everyone in the room react to that? And right now in Australia, we have hundreds of asylum seekers that are in detention centers.
Claire, can I bring you in on this? Because I know in Quillette you often deal with these issues and deal with the politics of these issues. And, you know, we've heard criticism of Australia's stance tonight, but Australia, of course, also points to the fact that it takes in a lot of refugee resettlement from countries. People have gone to other countries and then being resettled to Australia. We've seen around the world, haven't we, that the refugee issue, immigration issue more broadly, has become a real flashpoint, feeding into a political populism. We've seen across Europe, we've seen across the United States, we've seen barbed wire going back up around the borders of countries like Hungary. Talk to getting this right in a world where we have conflict, we have more movement of people, we have highly contested politics of immigration, and managing that mix when we know that there can be a blowback against that as well.
Yeah, it's a vexed issue, and I would just hesitate on it a little bit because this conflict is different. We're dealing with Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons, and they're invading Ukraine, and they could keep marching into Eastern Europe. It's a conflict that we haven't seen in the world for 70 years. We haven't seen a conflict like this since World War II. And it's a tectonic shift in global affairs. I think we need to keep in mind that we're going to have a massive refugee and migration issue, not just from Ukraine, but also from Russia. People are going to want to escape Russia. They are victims too in all of this. Their economy will implode sooner or later. And I think Australians do have to be generous. We are a rich country and we do have a lot of space. And so we do need to be generous. And I think we're moving into uncertain times. So we really do have to open up and try and attract people. I mean, we stopped immigration for 2 years, so I think we can up the intake a little bit now.
Let's go to our next questioner. It's a video from Miranda James.
To the panel, as women, what hurdles did you face during your journey to succeed, and how did you overcome those hurdles?
Wendy, you've just written a book about how you overcome those hurdles. But before we go to the specific about that, I've got to get to this because it tells us so much, and it goes back to your first point about the car and how long this takes and how slow change can be. But when you stood up Bob Hawke, and what was said to you at the time when you did that?
Well, fortunately, he's dead now, so he can't respond. But
when I say stood up Bob Hawke, I mean in a professional sense, of course.
No. I mean this. Well, it was political, professional. He came to meet the bicentennial people because the organisation was changing chairman and managing directors and so on every now and then. And I said to him I couldn't do that because we were opening a factory, my husband and I, in the western suburbs, and the children were coming and it was a big commitment on our place and we couldn't do it. Anyway, but I went back to the Bicentennial Authority about 4 o'clock and he was just walking out and he said, "You're the person who preferred her husband to me." I said, "Yes, I do, really." And he goes, "Amazing." And that was it. And all the things that were going to happen to me, I'd never get another job, you know.
Because people had said this would be the end of your career.
I know, he did. Well, I had 3 cabinet ministers ring me on the way out to the thing. And I said, well, actually, John Button, the leader of the Senate, is coming to do the opening in the western suburb. He's a big employer, et cetera, And they said, well, that's the finish of your career. And I just stood my ground, really, and said, well, I don't think it will be, and I'll take my chances. But
and it wasn't.
It wasn't. No.
Flex.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not a Bob Hawke story, but that story, I suppose, of inspiration and overcoming those hurdles.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I think, you know, before I even understood the limitations of womanhood, I dealt with the limitations of blackness. And so I think that womanhood came afterwards. I think I was quite naive to the idea that I would walk in spaces and people would think that I'd be less than or not equipped to deal or navigate because of some arbitrary title or identity. So I think with overcoming it, it's about acknowledging it, but not identifying too hard with it, because it goes back to what you were mentioning before about how we tend to homogenize things like womanhood in a way to, I don't know, find some kind of power. And in doing so, I found myself kind of like segmenting my identity, because when womanhood was perceived to be strong, I was strong. And when it's perceived to be nurturing, I'm now nurturing. And when it's perceived to be progressive, I'm progressive too. And I was like, what am I basing this in, if not everybody else's idea of what it should be rather than my own? And so for me, it always comes back to self, but I try to not think about overcoming. I'm always thinking about sustaining. You know, keeping an even keel, trying to get through it, enjoying it day by day, almost adopting stoicism to a point, because it just gets tiring to be reminded of all the ways, all the hurdles one needs to jump just to exist. Yeah. No more jumping.
One thing, though, race and gender divide us more than anything else. When I lived in America, race came first. It was the first issue to be resolved. And gender came second. Here it's the other way around. And there's no apparent reason for it. So do you think of yourself first when you don't get a job? Like, I didn't get lots of jobs because of my gender. And I'd seen enough inside to know that the blokes weren't that much more clever, probably not at all. But where does it come for you? Where does that intersectionality? Because it's very hard when we're trying to be everything to everyone.
Flex, where does that come?
Tell us.
I mean, it is. Like, being a black woman, I cannot separate it, but for my individual experience, I walk into spaces as a black person first. I don't think anybody would be like, she's just a woman, you know, it's the black woman I met, or tell me about your black experience. And so I think that sometimes I tend to maybe downplay the issues I face navigating womanhood and maybe the barriers, because I'm like, it's just one of the many. You know, I've got a more obvious one to deal with in the interim.
Fiona, I think initially it was quite funny. I was you know, reading some of the things you'd said in the past about feminism, and that you were uncomfortable with the term feminist, and particularly during the 60s, some of the more sort of, you know,
all the bra burners.
You said it, all the bra burners.
I don't know either, but well, I was only born in the 60s. So, but I think that's, you know, I think that goes back to the conversation we had earlier, you know, that I'd never thought of myself as a feminist necessarily, because I've been lucky enough and privileged enough and supported enough by my family and the people around me to put my hand up and do the things that I've wanted to do, and to have a good education. And in my current career, it's actually blokes who have supported me on the way through, because they've recognised that it's hard. You know, blokes regard, you know, in the things that I do in they call it agri-politics, it's like playing football. So they think that you're meant to go on and have a big bash, and, you know, everybody bashes up each other and you all swear at each other, and then you go to the pub afterwards. And so when I came through, you know, I have a different style, you know, and I was told, don't be anything but yourself. And I think that's, Flex, that's where it comes to. You have to be very confident in yourself, and you have to have it. And again, to the question we had earlier, it's about culture. It's about a culture of diversity in all respects, not just female, and a culture of belonging.
We've only just got 2 minutes left, and the clock's working against us, but I'll just go quickly to you, Claire, and then Najeeba. You just quickly, if you could say something about, you know, I'd read where you talked about the fetishisation of victimisation. It's just interesting in this frame around hurdles and how people see themselves. What do you mean by that?
Simply that it's not healthy for us as individuals to internalise victimhood status, and I don't think it's good for women in general for us to be seen as victims or as damsels in distress. We really want to encourage personal autonomy and agency and self-determination. And we do that, and we can celebrate female agency by celebrating female achievements, as opposed to, you know, stories about grievances and where things have gone wrong. Because women are out there, women are achieving all the time, every day.
And just that's worth a round of applause. Almost out of time, Najeeba. I'll have to ask really quickly, but what is? Yeah, I mean, we've heard about the hurdles you've had to face, but how do you overcome those things? What do you look to?
I mean, I've been through a whole lot of journey of hurdles, you know, from my childhood to all the way to where I am right now, you know, horrific experiences and, you know, stories of my childhood, and then coming to Australia, being detained, and many other things. I think what was quite important is, how do I actually face those extreme acts of violence and insecurity? How did I actually act the extreme torture and trauma that I faced? And what happened? So what we tried to do is to change the conversation around what happened to us to more what we became out of it. We became more resilient, and that's what I turn into and define and say evolution of fearlessness. Now we have become fearlessness. It's everything.
It's a wonderful phrase to finish on, isn't it? The evolution of fearlessness. That's all we have time for. Thank you again to our fantastic panel. Najeeba Wazefadost, Wendy McCarthy, Lillian Mami, Ahenkan, Claire Lehmann and Fiona Simson. Thank you so much to all of your questions. Thanks for you watching at home. Before we go tonight, a sad note, unfortunately, to end on. We'd like to extend our condolences to the family and friends of Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching, who we've learned just this evening died suddenly in Melbourne at the age of 52. We here at Q&A fondly remember Senator Kitching for her panel appearances over the years. So our thoughts with her family this evening. Yeah. Very, very sad news, and a sad note to finish on, but our thoughts are with the family tonight. On that note, next week the program will be live from Melbourne, and author and cultural icon Roxanne Gay joins the panel along with Labor's Anne Ali and former New South Wales Liberal Minister Prue Goward. And you can also catch me on China Tonight on Monday evening. Until then, have a good night.